I think that is bonkers, but I'm going to be analysing all the issues with a cabinet minister, a senior Conservative and a range of other voices. That story, plus the phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin about Ukraine, and the news that Joe Biden has an aggressive form of cancer. We're going to hear from one of his supporters in Congress. Join me, if you possibly can, after the news.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, the Chancellor has told LBC there are mixed views from fishermen on a new deal with the EU. The agreement will give European boats access to UK waters until 2038, which some say will damage the industry. Number 10 says it will also boost the economy and put more money in people's pockets. Rachel Reeves says British holidaymakers can look forward to using passport e-gates.
I hope that as soon as this year, people going on holiday or travelling for business will be not in those long queues of international travellers, but being fast-tracked through. And that's something that will make a material difference, certainly if you're travelling on holiday with your kids or you're rushing to a business meeting.
A third person has been arrested over suspected arson attacks on property linked to the Prime Minister. The 34-year-old was detained in Chelsea earlier. The BBC has confirmed this will be Gary Lineker's last week working for the broadcaster. He's apologised for a social media post saying he would never knowingly share anything anti-Semitic. And the King has written privately to Joe Biden to express his support for the former US president who has prostate cancer. Charles is still undergoing his own treatment for the disease. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 14 points at 86.99. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.18. LBC weather, showers in the west easing overnight. Most places clear and dry, cloudier in the northeast, a low of 3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. I'm a pretty gentle, relaxed, herbivorous kind of woodland creature. I don't get hot under the collar about much, but I'm getting hot this evening, and it is at the ludicrous, offensive and unpatriotic language being thrown around by the Brexit right against this new deal with the EU. Surrender, humiliation, sellout, betrayal. And all of this, note, because Keir Starmer has agreed to continue the fishing deal, first struck by Boris Johnson in his Brexit heyday for another dozen years. Johnson now regards that as apparently so disgraceful, he's resorted to spewing out bizarre sexual metaphors about the Prime Minister. Maybe he's trying to tell us something. Anyway, yes, fishermen are angry, and yes, they would like to exclude French and other European trawlers from more British water. But this is a deal which should make the whole country better off. Will bring good industrial jobs, give us better energy security, and in the shops, more choice and lower prices. It'll make it easier, we hope, to get through passport controls and to do deals to help combat illegal migration. So, betrayal? Fishing accounts for 0.03% of our output, and the deal will, anyway, make it easier for British fishermen to sell their produce abroad. Talking about surrender and betrayal is the language not of deal-making, but of war, and that is deranged. We are not at war with the European Union or France. We have been negotiating with them, give and take to increase prosperity. The Brexiteers have cost the economy, that is, you and me, around 4% of our GDP, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility. Bloomberg Economics, not exactly a wing of the Socialist Workers' Party, suggests it has cost Britain £100 billion every year in lost output. Brexiteers have been arguing today that the extra boost to the British economy from this deal, £9 billion a year, is nothing like enough. But they're also arguing at just the same time it goes too far. So, do a smaller deal for a bigger result? None of this makes sense. But for our friends on the hardcore Brexit side of the argument, nothing would. Try to soften the damage, try to mitigate it, and bring better jobs back home. You are surrendering. It's a betrayal. Again, this isn't a war. When I was a small boy, I was brought up with war comics full of brutal, cowardly foreigners fighting brave and cheery Tommies. And when I was 5 years old, that made a kind of sense. Well, I'm 65 now, and looking around me this evening, it seems to me that many of my fellow Britons haven't grown up by a day. And now to hear the reaction from the government, Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury and second in command to Rachel Reeves. Darren, this is an important deal, but it's not a world-changing deal, is it? You're in danger of slightly overselling it.
Well, look, it's an important deal in the context that we've done the India deal, the United States deal, and now we're making progress in our trading and security relationship with the EU. That's good news for Britain, for British jobs, for bills, for borders. But as we've said today, there's more that we want to do and more that we'll continue to work with our European counterparts on to improve trade and security relationships in the future.
In many ways, to me, the most attractive element of the deal was always the 150 billion euros available for defence. There's lots of British defence companies who desperately would like part of that. But it seems that although the door is open to that, there's still a huge amount of negotiating to go on. We may have to pay money. We may have to make all sorts of commitments to get at that money. So again, it's not a done deal, is it?
There are a number of things where we've still got to figure out more implementing detail, but the principles are set today, which is that we will be cooperating and collaborating on defence and security. That's important. And you're right, over 400,000 people in the UK work in the defence industry. We've got brilliant companies that make world-leading technologies. That's of interest to European member states as much as it is to anybody else. So there's a benefit for us to be involved, but also it's a win-win for European countries as well as for the UK.
So can you say to people listening who might be involved with British Aerospace or Babcock or indeed Rolls-Royce that as a result of this deal there will certainly be more high-quality jobs available?
Yes, because we're going to be improving our cooperation and relationship with the EU and subject to further details, having access to procurement opportunities from EU member states that get support through the funding the European Commission's made available to them.
In a similar way, the Prime Minister was talking about the e-gates issue, and the government has been putting out lots of pictures of happy British holidays on sun-kissed beaches, suggesting that the e-gate issue will be resolved this summer. But since the detail of the agreement suggests that has to be agreed not just by the EU, which has put their tick on it, but by the individual countries, you have no idea when the e-gates will actually be open to British tourists.
Well, there are two steps, as you alluded to. One was you needed permission from the European Commission, and then you need to make sure that operationally the technology is in place in the member states that you may go on holiday.
And the second bit is missing.
So that's work that we've got to do. But there's an obvious priority list of countries that Brits go on holiday to in the European Union, and we'll be able to work with those countries now to say that now the European Commission has agreed, we want to be able to make sure that we can share those border gates.
So to be absolutely clear, you want to try and get an agreement in place working for places like Spain, France, Italy before the summer.
We want to move as quickly as possible, and I'm sure the Foreign Office will give more updates on that. But look, we think that's in the interest of those member states as well as for UK tourists, because of course when you've got very long queues of people waiting for the third country route or countries that can use the quicker, often automated route, that's important for those airports.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's huge quantities of time. But again, there are new EU rules which suggest that people are going to have fingerprints, biometric tests coming into the European Union at all. And that will create huge queues as well. And that is, correct me if I'm wrong, not touched at all in this deal.
I don't know the answer to that particular question.
It's not touched. The queues are going to be worse because of these fingerprints and other tests than they are at the moment.
Sure. Look, we'll need to get you an answer for that from the relevant department. But the principle is important, which is that we can share border gates. That's agreed today. The European Commission has said there's no legal blockage to that anymore, and now it's just a case of implementing it. And I'm sure the points that you make will be part of the consideration from the team in the Foreign Office.
Prime Minister said today that this was going to add about £9 billion to our GDP each year, which is tiny compared to the 100 billion or so that we have lost since leaving the EU. How has that figure of 9 billion been put together, and are you sure about it? Could it go higher? Could it be lower?
So the numbers based on an assessment of the food and drink arrangements today for import and export food and drink products, the so-called phyto and phytosanitary arrangements, but also some of the tariff arrangements on UK steel, for example, that's embedded in the document. Do we want that to go higher? Yeah, of course we do. And there are other things that we want to negotiate with the EU to improve trade within our red lines in the manifesto of not rejoining the customs union and the single market. So this is a good start. But do we want to go further? Yes, of course we do.
And there's an awful lot of younger people listening to this show, Darren, and they will be disappointed that the youth mobility scheme hasn't been part of this deal. We were told it was likely to be part of the deal for weeks and weeks and weeks, and at the last minute it's not there. Why not? What went wrong?
So the agreement today is that we're going to design a specific scheme for the UK, similar to the ones we have with, I think, 13 other countries, most commonly Australia and New Zealand, where it's a visa-based, time-limited scheme where if you're under a certain age, you're able to get the visa and go to that country for a couple of years to study, to work, and then to be able to come home again. That's the type of scheme we want to design for the UK. That wasn't available off the shelf from the European Union, and so there's more work to be done.
Could you not have designed it quickly in time for the deal?
Well, look, there were negotiations on it. Of course there were, and it's in the deal today that we're going to work to get this bespoke scheme off the ground. But of course, we've got a bit more work to do, and that's what the team will be working on now.
It's just that it looks as if the European Union wanted an uncapped scheme for everybody to take part of, as in the old days, and we said no.
Well, we're clear on what the terms are of our engagement, and for that youth exchange scheme, which we think is important and valuable for young people, it has to be designed in a way where there is caps and time limits and a visa-based scheme for administering it. And that's the type of scheme that we're going to be designing now with our counterparts in the European Commission.
All right, Darren Jones, even if you don't think it was a historic day, it was certainly an important one. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. In a moment, we're going to hear from the Conservatives as well. But first, let's get the thought of LBC's political editor, Natasha Clark, who was at that summit earlier on. Natasha, you can mark my homework if you like, but were those, as it were, the key points of questioning still about this deal that we just heard?
Yeah, I think that's fair, Andrew. And today I think what we saw was lots of doors opening with this new so-called deal, but it's not quite clear if we're going to be able to go through all of them and when that's going to happen. Lots of good starts, but I think there is a lot more devil in the detail to come. There's no details, for example, on this EU experience scheme that you just mentioned with Darren Jones just then. We don't know whether they'll cap the numbers. We know it'll be a visa-based scheme. We don't know when that will start or finish. We don't exactly know how much money we're going to continue to pay to the EU. That's been a very common cause for Brexiteers who have been very upset about the money that we pay to the EU. We've not yet got access to that EU defence scheme, like you just mentioned as well with the Minister. So there's lots of unanswered questions in this deal. And I think it's a very good start, but there's lots of holes to pick in it too.
And what about the so-called SPS, the agriculture and food parts?
I'm going to ban you from saying SPS, Andrew.
It's a horrible phrase. You're quite right. No one understands. All right, folks. Food and agricultural
checks
stuff.
And standards.
Now, the Prime Minister says that we are going to have bigger variety and lower prices in our shops. But if you actually look at food prices inside the EU and inside the UK post-Brexit, theirs have been higher than ours.
It's going to be incredibly difficult to actually reduce prices in the shops. And Nick Thomas-Symonds, the EU Minister, was very clear on that on Sunday. He would not commit to that. The government hopes that will happen. They hope also that they will see more choice in the supermarkets as well. I think that is a good deal, and anything that's going to reduce those burdensome Brexit checks, of course, that's good. But if you look at the statistics for this deal overall, just adding 9 billion to the economy by 2040, it's not this big, massive Brexit trade deal that everybody wanted. But I agree with you that it's not a massive Brexit betrayal either. It is somewhere in the middle, as classic with Brexit. It is a negotiation. It is British politics. Everybody has had to come to a compromise. But that is what politics is.
It is indeed. Natasha, thank you very much indeed. I'm joined now by the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade and Conservative MP for Arundel and South Downs, Andrew Griffiths. Andrew, I was having a bit of a go at your side of the argument at the top of the show for hyperbole. All this language about betrayal and treason and surrender, it's far too much. People are tired of that kind of hyperbole.
Well, look, as Natasha says, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of hyperbole from the government coming
Both
today.
Both sides, I would agree.
Think they've just
rediscovered,
gravity or water. Look, the truth is, we don't know most of the detail. There are some important red lines, some principles, right? You know, we're in the business of democratic politics, and it's right to expose where there are differences. There is an important principle that's been ceded today in terms of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
Yes.
The rules that relate to our energy system, and particularly for businesses, the sort of emissions trading schemes that they participate in, which is really important, the competitiveness of the UK
Should get
economy.
prices down.
Well, it'll only get prices down in one direction. What it'll actually do is put prices up on those products that we import from elsewhere in the world. It's a carbon border tariff, right? Most weeks, politicians come along and tell you how terrible tariffs are when it's President Trump putting them on. What we're doing is signing up to an indefinite European tariff, the rules of which will be decided by the European Court of Justice. And the same thing is true of those food standards. I'm not going to say that SPS words that you were talking about with Natasha, but in future, the rules that relate to British food, how it's produced, what's safe, will be set back in Brussels again. And you've spent many years covering that. Now we're back into a world where you've got co-determination between Westminster and Brussels. I don't think that's how the best basis for a modern economy now to compete.
On food, our attitudes to what's safe, what's acceptable, have been almost identical to the European for the best part of the last 60 years. That's not going to change anything very much, is it?
So why is it the big new thing, right? I mean, you're right. De facto, there have been some important derogations about genomics and genetically modified food and things, but you're right, in substance, we, like most other economies, Europe, but also Australia, New Zealand, other modern Western economies, have very similar sets of standards. But why try and codify the idea that the arbiter of what we do here in Britain will be a European court again? You
and your colleagues have made a lot, you just have, about the European Court of Justice. But back in 2020, who was it who signed up Northern Ireland entirely to the European Court of Justice directly and with no derogations?
Well, the situation,
somebody called Boris Johnson, I think.
Well, look, I don't think anyone, Andrew, was against that at the time. And why is that the case? Which is an unusual situation that everyone would acknowledge. And in many cases, it's suboptimal for the people of Northern Ireland. But it's also because of the very unique history, the absence, which everybody wants, of a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So it is a very special situation. What the government's done today is very different. They've effectively expanded that to the whole of the United Kingdom, as you say.
In one small area. And they've also, by the way, loosened the ECJ's grip over Northern Ireland at the same time.
Well, look, that's to be welcome. But today, I think, in fairness, we'll all wake up tomorrow with the European Court of Justice. Once we see the detail that we haven't seen, we'll wake up tomorrow with the European Court of Justice having more influence about how our business operate, the sort of standards on food than we had yesterday. Now, I think, I won't use B words or anything like that, but I think that is a very, very significant decision. I mean, it's interesting, the Prime Minister didn't even come to Parliament today to outline the deal. We don't have most of the details, or we've got press conferences. And when you look at something like 12 years of giving away our fish, that looks like a massive reach from Europe that the Prime Minister's capitulated on.
It was a Conservative deal originally, of course, but we can end on one. We can end on one note of consensus. It's always better for a Prime Minister to come to the House of Commons first and be properly prosecuted. I'm sure we'll be discussing this for a very long time, but for now, Andrew Griffith, thank you very much indeed for coming in. So, what's your view of this deal? Is it a betrayal or is it good news? Text me on 84850 or email mar@lbc.co.uk. I'm going to be joined by former EU Commissioner and World Trade expert in a few minutes to get into the nuts and bolts of what this reset means for the UK. But you're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, and the time now is 6:18.
This is LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:20. Right, we've done a bit of the politics. Let's drill down further into what this deal will actually mean in concrete terms. Beyond the warm words, what does the reset mean? In a moment, I'm going to be joined by Baroness Cathy Ashton, former Vice President of the European Commission and their lead on defence and security issues. But first, let's hear from the World Trade Editor for the Financial Times, Peter Foster. I wanted him to tell me if you could put a figure on the concessions made in terms of fishing in this deal and how it compares to the other areas where we largely benefit.
Well, it is. I mean, if you look at the value of UK food and drink exports to the EU, about £14.2 billion last year, and about 1.2 billion in fish. So we send 14 times more exports to food and drink generally than fish. I think the other thing that's important to say is that fishing accounts for 0.03% of the UK economy. It's a tiny piece of our economy. The fleet is 5,500 boats. Obviously important to those industries, but in the grand scheme of things, what Keir Starmer's done is simply made a trade-off here between getting better access for our food and drink exporters. Still, ultimately, a fairly small chunk of the 150 billion plus pounds worth of exports that we do, but nonetheless, an important first step. I think potentially also to streamlining the exporting process to the EU, because if you can do it with food and drink exports, maybe in the fullness of time, you could do it with other things too, depending on whether you had a government that was prepared to engage more fully with the EU single market and customs union. Obviously, this particular government isn't there at the moment.
And the Prime Minister used a figure of 9 billion extra for the economy each year as a result of that, which compared to what people talk about, 100 billion loss a year since Brexit, seems pretty piffling.
It is. It's a very small amount. So if the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, estimates the consensus forecast is that Brexit makes us about 4% GDP, about 4% smaller than it otherwise would have been, this is equivalent to 0.2%. So it's about a 20th of that lost 4% of GDP. So it's small beer. And that only relates to the food and drink exporting smoothing, and also the piece about energy trading, which is important as well going forward, I think, particularly for the green transition. But this is ultimately small beer. So what you have is both sides, the government bigging up this great trade reset. It's not that, it's pretty small beer. But by the same token, the other side bigging it up as a great betrayal on the Brexit side. It's not that either. No single market, no customs union. Fundamentally, the Brexit settlement that was reached by Boris Johnson and David Frost remains in place. We're not going back into the single market. We're not doing free movement. We're not paying into the EU budgets, except in very limited spaces where we need to get this veterinary agreement to smooth the UK export. So, both sides making a big deal of not very much.
Except, of course, that if you set out in one direction rather than another, you can end up in a very, very different place. So this could be the first steps towards something much bigger.
Indeed. I mean, ask me in 10 years' time whether this was the gateway to a deeper relationship. I think one of the troubles, Andrew, is that I think some people think there is this perfect equilibrium where we're just on the outside. The trouble is with the EU is the closer we get. So the more deeply you engage, the more you start to say, well, why don't we have a seat at the table? Why don't we have a say over all these expensive regulations? And so I think you reach a tipping point, which is why the government is sticking with this no single market, no customs union line, because the minute you get closer and closer, if you want to increase those benefits, you have to pay more into the system. You ultimately have to accept free movement. You have to end up in a place where Switzerland does, where you're a rule taker and you're paying into the budgets, you're effectively affecting free movement. And, it's not at all clear to me that that's where the country really is at the moment, and it's certainly not clear to this government. But yeah, let's see where we end up in 10 years' time.
And in terms of the possible benefits, there was a huge amount made of the 150 billion euro defence fund that British companies like Babcock and others would have access to possibly under this deal. But that remains in some doubt. That's still to be negotiated in detail. Is there a danger that that fantastic magnetic lure of better jobs and much more work for the British defence industry doesn't actually happen?
Well, it's certainly, like a lot of this deal, yet to be negotiated. So there's a lot of language in the text of these deals, which are commitments to we will explore, etc. To access that 150 billion euro facility, to be a player in that, we have to do a side agreement with the European Union as a third country. Other countries have done that. There will be a fee attached to that, and the ADS, which is the main defence and industry lobby, they're very much sitting on the fence, giving their verdict on this deal, saying we need to wait and see what strings are attached to us gaining that. I mean, I think broadly, both the European Union and the UK government are committed now to spending much more on defence, and those industries will benefit from that. And I think politically that's important in the UK, not least because defence industry supply chains are quite geographically spread in the UK, and the government's keen that money should be spread around the country.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for helping me. That was the World Trade Editor at the FT, Peter Foster there. Now, to dig more into the defence agreements within this deal and how it affects our foreign policy and cooperation with the EU, I'm joined in the studio by Baroness Cathy Ashton, the former Vice President of the European Commission, who is also their High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Cathy, great to have you in the studio. Just picking up from my conversation with Peter Foster there, do you see this as the beginning of a journey?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think what we can see from Brussels' reaction to it is that they are delighted to have a partner they can talk to and with whom they can start to talk about these big issues that concern them, especially on defence and security and the future of Europe as a continent beyond the EU.
It's hard to imagine another big jump towards the EU before a general election. We heard there about the government's position on the customs union and the single market. But if it's possible to have dynamic alignment and do a deal on agricultural produce and farming produce, why not other areas as well? Well,
indeed. And actually, if you talk to others, particularly the Swiss, who've been involved with dynamic alignment, they see this as being very much about their sovereign status. They choose. It's not automatic, as they would say. It means that you make judgments each time. So it fits very well. Exactly. Each sector, what works for you, what can help ease the possibility of a stronger economy, greater trade, and so on.
Now, Cathy, the area you probably know most about, I guess, is security. So just, as it were, pull back a little bit and give us the wider context of the importance of the security deal.
Anyone looking at what's happened since the days of Brexit will be mindful of the fact that we have a war in Europe for the first time since the Second World War. And it's a war that doesn't just affect Ukraine. It has huge implications for the future of an entire continent, for the values we hold, for the beliefs that we have. And so the context in which these discussions are taking place is how do we ensure the security of Europe, especially if we're not sure that we can rely totally on the transatlantic partnership to provide everything that it did. I don't think we should get hysterical that it's all going to disappear.
But we're going to have to make our own missiles and our own shells and our own many other things in due course. Now, inevitably, the French defence industry is going to push back quite hard because they always do. But are you convinced, looking at this, that British industrial capacity is going to be used by the European Union to do this?
The European Union want the British involved in this for a whole range of reasons. Their capacity, their leadership, their knowledge, their abilities. And part of that has got to be that they are confident that we can participate in terms of the hardware too. There are lots of issues to be resolved, without question. Rules of origin is a pesky problem too when you look at how European money is used and spent in third countries. But the political will is everything in Europe.
Just one final, we were talking about security there. I'd be very interested, since I have you here, to get your view on the news that's just broken that a 2-hour conversation on the phone between Trump and Putin has just ended, and Vladimir Putin has described it as frank and meaningful. Do you think it's either of those things?
Well, I think it's interesting they had a two-hour conversation, and what we've got is frank and meaningful. In other words, I have a suspicion that not much has changed, and that what we've got is President Putin being very happy to have long conversations, lots of detail, lots of discussion. But I don't think if I were President Zelensky, I'd be holding out much hope for that.
Putin just carries on with his war in the meantime. Cathy Ashton, thank you very, very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Now, after news broke last night that former President Joe Biden has an aggressive form of cancer, I'm going to be talking to one of his colleagues from Congress. The time now, 6:30, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
The Chief Secretary to the Treasury has been unable to tell LBC whether British holidaymakers will see shorter queues at European borders this summer. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, Darren Jones says there is still more work to be done on a new deal with the EU. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have spoken on the phone for more than 2 hours. Reports from Moscow have described his discussion as very, very informative and helpful, but Putin insists the root causes of the crisis need to be eliminated. And a third person has been arrested as part of an investigation into arson attacks at properties linked to the Prime Minister. The 34-year-old was detained in Chelsea earlier. LBC weather, showers in the west easing overnight. Most places clear and dry, cloudier in the northeast, a low of 3 degrees.
What if you could have the news your way?
What if you could organise the news to prioritise your interests?
Through award-winning reporting, both on air and in your hand.
The all-new LBC app.
The most informed debate.
Delivered in your hands the way you want it.
Your news, just the way you want it.
News your way, now in your hands.
The all-new LBC app. Download it for free from the App Store. This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 6060 973.
6:33. Let's look at a couple of big stories abroad now, starting with that call between Presidents Trump and Putin about Ukraine we were just discussing, and also the news coming out of Israel today that they are allowing in some aid, although a minimal amount, into Gaza after a blockade that has prompted criticism from around the world. The Independent's World Affairs editor, Sam Kiley, is joining me to talk about both of those things. Sam, first of all, that news just breaking about the Putin-Trump call. It's very, very hard to see anything concrete from this, but all the mood music seems to be the war grinds on and there is no kind of breakthrough with the two men talking.
Sorry, Andrew, somebody in your office was talking over you there, but I think that the top line coming out at the moment is from Putin, who rather inevitably has got his version of how this phone call went in first. Now, this had been billed very much and anticipated by the Trump administration as a final demonstration of Trump's ability to persuade the Kremlin to do the right thing and join a ceasefire process. But what actually happened after 2 hours, according to Vladimir Putin, is nothing. Except that they have agreed with Donald Trump that they ought to work bilaterally between Russia and Ukraine to come up with what Putin calls a memorandum for a peace process. And he also signaled in his statement following these talks, Andrew, that there was a need to focus from the Russian perspective on the issue of what he calls settlements, ironically, echoes of Israel there. What he means by that is areas captured in Ukraine by Russia, over which the Russians not only lay a claim, but have illegally annexed the Crimea and 4 other provinces, none of which are actually entirely occupied, with the exception of Crimea, by Russia. We haven't heard yet, though, from Donald Trump, who I guess must be smarting, really, that he didn't extract much more out of his friend in the Kremlin.
Well, absolutely, because these are the identical war aims that Vladimir Putin started with, and he doesn't seem to have given an inch on any of them. You'd almost think that he is tapping along Donald Trump while he tries to normalize relations between America and Russia and get the kind of lift off sanctions and the better economic deals he can get without conceding anything on his war.
I think that's exactly his agenda. Absolutely everything that's happened, including, at least based on his readout from this phone call up to now, but over this entire year, the United States, through Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Rubio, the secretary, and the negotiators who've been to Moscow, all have taken entirely Russian positions, whether it is Russia's claim to Ukrainian territories, whether it is preemptively saying that there's no chance in the future of security guarantees for Ukraine, whether it's suspending military aid, blinding the Ukrainians temporarily in terms of the US intelligence feed, and so on. Now, what was slightly different about this moment, though, was that it had been previewed with a suggestion that, in Trump's words, he'd got, and I'm quoting him, pissed off with Putin over his failure to move towards a ceasefire. So far, we haven't seen that how much anger Donald Trump has shown, it certainly had no effect on Vladimir Putin. I think the bigger figure every time they're in the room, both literally and figuratively together, the bigger figure is the much smaller Mr. Putin.
Indeed. So no real evidence of American pressure on Russia, no real evidence of American pressure on Israel either, Sam. We've had news today that the Israelis are letting in a small amount of aid, humanitarian aid, but they also seem to be dividing up Gaza into kind of huge new military encampments. Just bring us up to date on that.
Well, the latest there is, and it's caused outrage around the world, a number of European countries have demanded that Israel cease its operations immediately in Gaza. The Israelis have said absolutely clearly that they intend to reoccupy Gaza. A smidgen of humanitarian aid is being offered by the Israelis, reportedly baby food and the like, but no real sign that the humanitarian situation, which has a population of 2.5 million people, according to the UN, on the verge of starvation, are going to get any aid. Indeed, there is a proposal around to have private American corporations take over from the United Nations, which have been looking after the Palestinians since 1948 in many cases, in order to replace the UN as some kind of privatized charity. But the reality is, and this is very clear from statements from Netanyahu, from other members of his Likud government, but also extremists in his cabinet, that the end game from the Israeli perspective is to make Gaza unlivable and to move the population out.
And then to snaffle it. Sam Kiley, thank you very much indeed for talking to me tonight. And so to America, with the news that Joe Biden, the former president, has an aggressive form of prostate cancer. It's spread to his bones. It's been a horrible week for him and his supporters, not least because of the book spelling out in detail how the mainstream media and Democratic Party colluded in hiding just how unfit for office he was during the final stages of his presidency. Let's talk now to Shri Thanedar, a Democratic congressman for Michigan, who recently brought forward and has since dropped articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. Welcome, Congressman. Before we get on to Joe Biden and that sad story, let me ask you about the articles of impeachment, what you are trying to achieve and why you've dropped them.
Look, this president has conducted impeachable offenses, and that needed to be pointed out. The corruption, bribery, just the talk about the $400 million plane, a gift from Qatar, a foreign government, as if it's a normal thing. It's not a normal thing. No president of the United States has ever done that. His Trump meme coin to benefit himself personally, his family personally. So using this office of presidency, he's benefited personally, his family has benefited. This needed to be called out.
So that sounds the kind of thing that should have gone forward from what you've said, these articles of impeachment. Why haven't they?
Well, look, people are looking at it differently. Are we going to win? Do we have the votes to win this? Is this going to be a distraction? So those are kind of questions being raised in my own party, my own colleagues.
So politics as usual then. Let's turn to Joe Biden. And this book that's come out, we've talked about it on this show before, suggesting really quite serious levels of collusion. We could all see Joe Biden stumbling and having problems with his words. That was in front of the cameras. But the allegation is that really he was not cognitively able to serve another term, and that frankly, the Democratic Party and the Democrat-leading media should have acknowledged that much earlier.
Well, look, in month of August, I got a call from White House. And Mr. Biden's assistant asked me if I would join the president. The president would like me to join him on Air Force One as he travels from Washington, D.C. to my district, which is Detroit, Michigan. And I gladly accepted that invitation. And as I was on the plane, I had a time, almost 30 minutes, to spend with this President Biden. This is the time when he was getting attacked that he should step down, not run for re-election. And Mr. Biden was defiant. I had several questions. I asked him some very pointed questions. This was there was no press there, no staff there. So this was a very candid conversation. And Mr. Biden was very defiant. And to me, he looked like, he's an 80-year-old man and has his normal health issues. But he certainly looked capable of governing. He certainly knew, he has a vast amount of experience. And I felt that he was qualified to be the president and qualified to run for re-election.
So you suggest to me, in a way, no cover-up, no collusion, but perhaps a little bit of wish fulfillment around people who were close to him and fond of him. Because, of course, if he had acknowledged the problem earlier, your party would have had a longer and perhaps more searching hunt for a new candidate, and perhaps you might have won that election. So these are big issues. What do you think? I don't want to write an obituary. He's got cancer. He's fighting it, I'm sure, very bravely. But what do you think history will make of Joe Biden?
Look. I feel sad. My heart is hurting to hear that. He's a friend. He's a good person. He's an extremely kind man. And look, he has accomplished so much with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. There is just so much President Joe Biden did in his 4 years. He is one of the most accomplished president. Often doesn't get the credit for, but he's one of the most accomplished. And I feel sad that he's suffering through this, and I'm with his family. He's in my prayers that he recovers quickly from all this. But I think he got a little bit of a bad rap. I think he got a little bad deal from his own party. I think they weren't kind to him, and they panicked in the end after that horrible debate performance. But that panic was not essential. He could have got elected, and panicking it that late in the election cycle was not productive.
So that's what you think, in a sense, the original sin was. We've just been talking with Sam Kiley about the terrible things going on in Gaza at the moment. Do you think if President Biden had been re-elected, the situation in Israel would be different?
Well, look, Joe Biden is a foreign policy expert. He has been the head of the foreign policy while he was a senator. So as opposed to this erratic policies of President Trump wakes up in the morning and just decides to do whatever he wants to do. No reason, no rational, no strategy. Whereas Joe Biden knew what he was doing. His decisions were very sound. And I think we wouldn't have this kind of chaos in Gaza if it was Joe Biden.
All right, Congressman Thanedar, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. As the fallout of the Prime Minister's controversial immigration speech carries on, we'll hear from a pollster who's found out it might not have been as offensive to the wider public as some people thought. But the time now, 6:45.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
Wasn't Brexit all about giving our government the right to make our own decisions? I'll be interviewing the man who negotiated the deal, Cabinet Office Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Ian Dale on LBC.
Conditions apply.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:47. Keir Starmer may have been basking in warm words and allyship with Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa at the European summit today, but he may be falling back to earth with a bump as we speak, because he's facing his backbenchers in Parliament, and many of them are not too pleased about the welfare and winter fuel changes he's bringing in. Our political correspondent, Aggie Chambre, has had her ear to the door. Aggie, this meeting is still carrying on. It's too early to get a verdict on it, but you were talking to people going in. What was the mood?
I was talking to people going in and quite literally did have my ear up against the door, as you do in these very strange meetings. It was attended, as I think you'd expect, by basically all of the cabinet. Sir Keir Starmer arrived early, before most of his cabinet, and he started off by talking about, I'm told it was very positive, upbeat stuff about his hat trick of good trade deals, as they were called. He also talked about the need for reform on welfare. He then went on to Gaza, and apparently was quite strong on the need to get food in. And he also said the next phase of this government is going to be about cost of living. He said also it's clear the reform are the main opposition and the competitors for power, not the Tories. And then came the questions.
Which we don't know about yet, is that right? Or we do know a few.
He basically started by getting the questions, but actually didn't respond to them. And there are a couple of questions, I'm told, which were described to me as just London MPs slagging off his immigration speech. But one question from Diane Abbott, which apparently was quite a long, described more of a speech than a question, but about immigration, about that language of island of strangers. And I think there is still a lot of anger.
A lot of anger. That's really interesting. I saw Diane Abbott earlier on today. I thought that the Speaker was being a bit mean to her at Prime Minister's questions last week, because she was bobbing up again and again and again, clearly wanted to intervene on this island of strangers subject and wasn't able to. So it'll be very interesting to see how he responds to her in this meeting. Any suggestion, however, that, away from the speech and away from the big EU deal that we've just been hearing, there is worry about the benefit cuts. And also, one of his former advisors was saying at the weekend that he thinks they're definitely going to have to raise taxes.
I think there is definite concern, and it was really striking listening to the Chancellor Rachel Reeves speaking to our colleague Sheila Fogarty earlier on winter fuel, where she said the line has definitely changed, Andrew, because just last week...
I thought the same.
Yeah.
I'm glad we agree.
Just last week, you had Number 10 basically saying, we cannot change this, the policy is the policy. And Rachel Reeves today saying, we always listen to our voters when asked if she might change the threshold on winter fuel, saying, we're always listening, we want to do the right thing. So I think lots of MPs I've spoken to as well think something has to come down the tracks, and it might well be that.
That sounded to me the language of a shift coming. Aggie, thank you very much indeed. And that comment we were talking about by Keir Starmer about the danger of Britain becoming an island of strangers continues to resonate among those who agree with it and those who find it an unsettling echo of Enoch Powell. But polling by the More in Common group suggests that many people already feel that way. Let's talk to its director, Luke Trill. Luke, you did this research actually before the Prime Minister spoke. It's important to say that. What did you discover?
Yeah, so this was some research for a new project we're running with UCL Policy Lab and Citizens UK. And what we found was we asked that question directly. Do you sometimes feel like a stranger in your own country? And we found that 44% of the country agreed with that. They said at least sometimes they felt like a stranger in their own country. But the interesting thing was, and I think this is perhaps the limitation of the Prime Minister's speech, was that when we then dug into that in focus groups, yes, immigration and integration were part of it, but they were just two of the issues which were making people feel like this. People also talked about social media, decline of town centres. The cost of living crisis actually came up the most of anything. People saying, I just can't afford to go out and socialise and be with people anymore.
There's so much to talk about here, Luke. Did you pick that phrase about feeling like strangers in their own land consciously out of an Enoch Powell speech, or was that just something that occurred to you?
No, absolutely not. It's just quite a good way of getting at how people feel in terms of sort of social dislocation and disconnection.
The question is interesting only because the Prime Minister's office might have gone through exactly the same process and also not looked at Enoch Powell. But you say that there are lots of issues around there. What about the different groups? Who feels most alienated?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is we were able, because this was a mega poll, it was over 10,000 respondents, to really break it down. And some of the interesting things we found was that actually it was Asian Britons who were more likely than white Britons to agree with that sentiment that sometimes they feel like a stranger in their own country. But the big divide was one of income and wealth. So what we found was that those on lower incomes were about twice as likely to say they felt disconnected from wider society, another one of the questions we asked, than those on higher incomes. So that was one gap. And then the other gap, interestingly, around trust was age. One of the questions we asked is, can you trust most people or can you not be too careful? Young people, half as likely to say that you can trust most people most of the time than over 75. So there's clearly something going on there. Younger people, those
poorer people incomes, feeling elbowed out. That is really, really worrying, Luke. You're absolutely right. Now, since I have you here, however, we started the show, we've done most of the show on this big EU-UK deal today, and I think you've been polling on that. What can you tell me?
Yeah, we have. So look, the top line is most people would like us to have a better relationship with Europe. If you ask, should we be closer to Europe, further away, or keep it as about 56% say they'd like a closer relationship. They want Brexit to work better, and lots of people think it hasn't worked. Although interestingly, in our polling, we found people think it hasn't worked, or more people think it hasn't worked because politicians got it wrong rather than it could never have worked. Yeah. And so this kind of incremental improvement to make the relationship better actually does hit the sweet spot with lots of the public. They don't want to go back to noisy Brexit rows, and the thought of that turns lots of people off, but getting a sort of better working relationship appeals to lots of people.
So again, very interesting, because I started the show by mocking some of the language used about surrender and treason and betrayal. I just get the sense that across the country, people are just sick and tired of the whole thing. They just want it to go away. They want a rational, better relationship, but they just don't want to talk about it in the way that we have been for the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I often joke that old Victorian adage about children sums up where the public are on EU relations. They want it to be seen and not heard. They want to be able to get through the passport gate, trade better, but they don't want to go back to 2016 to 2019.
Well, that is probably good news for the Prime Minister. Luke Trill, thank you very much indeed for coming in and helping me out. Now, the Spanish government has just told Airbnb to block more than 65,000 holiday listings in the country over rule violations. The bigger picture is that across Spain, a shortage of affordable housing has caused big demonstrations against the company, and that's gone on in more than 40 cities. Some of them, like Barcelona, are taking their own action already. Barcelona wants to close down all the 10,000 apartments listed there as short-term rentals to help locals find somewhere to live. Now, Spain is, of course, one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. But aren't there parts of this story which seem a bit familiar? Unaffordable rents, particularly for young people, the easy money flowing in for Airbnb rentals, and growing local disquiet. I'm joined now by Lisa Francesca Nand, the travel journalist and managing director of The Travel Experts. Lisa, thanks so much for joining me. Let's start with the Spanish issue. Do you think what's going on in Spain is actually going to impact quite a lot of British people who had assumed in the past they could go to Barcelona or Malaga or Madrid or somewhere else in Spain, Seville, and be able to have an Airbnb quite easily? It's going to be a shock, isn't it?
Do you know, when I was asked this question about a year and a half ago, when the protests started to emerge, first of all in Tenerife and then in Mallorca and then sort of spreading to Barcelona and other places, I was saying, actually, no, I don't think it would have an impact on the number of visitors that go there. But, you know, as these protests and these sort of anti-tourism measures do go on, there is a possibility it will impact on people visiting, Brits visiting Spain. Almost 18 million British people visit Spain annually, which is a lot. You know, we're talking with, I don't know if there's a sense of irony going from immigration to us, going somewhere as holiday makers, but that is a lot of people. And I'm a British person, but I grew up in Spain as an expat, and I can see all angles of it. You know, people are being priced out of their accommodation. It's big. Airbnb is big business. It's gone from, people renting out their spare room or even their sofa at some points to being big business. And you can see when, certainly where I come from on the Costa del Sol, there are people that can't get an apartment for the whole year. They can only rent it out for 9 months, because then everyone else makes the big bucks when they rent it out through the peak periods. And you can't blame them. So there's so much to unpack in this subject.
And Lisa, let me ask you about the nature of Airbnb, because, in the old days, it was assumed that this was individual people or families renting out their home when they were away, and it was a very sensible way of making use of places that would otherwise be empty. But I get the impression, particularly in Spain, companies are now buying up and renting out huge quantities of properties that would otherwise be available for local people.
Absolutely. It's gone to from being quite a fun disruptor in the market to really disrupting people's ways of life. And it's virtually impossible as a young person in Madrid or Barcelona to get affordable accommodation. I was in Madrid a few months ago and I saw stickers everywhere saying sort of swear words and then followed by Airbnb. And when you do try and find a place to rent, there are thousands and thousands of places where you can just rent a room. They don't even rent a whole flat these days. The professional Airbnb people rent a room to people, so it's almost like an HMO for homes of multiple occupation for a holiday situation. So they're earning even more money that way, and it's big business now.
And finally, I just wonder whether this could spread closer to home, because I know Edinburgh, for instance, has a huge Airbnb issue. I guess Oxford, Cambridge, Bath, Central London all have the same kind of issue, and they're all places where it's very, very hard for young people to find somewhere to rent for themselves. Do you see this as a movement that can spread?
I think it has spread. We do have protests. We have people talking about tourism tax in places like Edinburgh. Of course, Cornwall has a problem. The Cotswolds has a problem. The Lake District has a problem. I live here in Brighton, and that's a very busy place and an expensive place for people to get on the property market. So it seems that, tourism is a wonderful thing, can be a force for good. But I think there's got to be some sort of regulation to make sure local people are protected as well.
I think people should invent something new called a hotel. But Lisa, thank you very much indeed for that. Indeed. I'm going to be back with you tomorrow. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player and the new LBC app, where you can read and watch the latest from LBC, listen to it, put your news categories in the order you want. You can pause and rewind live radio, and you can listen to a range of podcasts, everything there. So download the all-new LBC app for free from your app store right now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. If you are a Remainer, you probably think today's agreement with the EU was rather good, as it takes us back into the orbit of the EU. If you're an ultra-leaver, you probably regard it as a complete sellout. Is it? It's being heavily trumpeted by Keir Starmer.